Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Louise Mirror, our President and CEO, Agnes Sue Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and Pam Schaffler, our Chair Emerita, as well as all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Diane Max, and the late Adam Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors, none of the work of New York Historical would be possible without your continued and committed support. Now, I am honored to be recognized as the founding director of our Center for Women's History, the first such center of its kind within the walls of a major museum in the United States. In only a few short years, we've been able to accomplish so much in terms of scholarship, education, programs, collecting, and not least of all, exhibitions, all of which foreground women's critical role in American history. Tonight's important program is emblematic of that mission, Rethinking Feminist Sexual Politics. And now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Nona Willis Aronowitz is the sex and love columnist for Teen Vogue and the author of the upcoming book, Bad Sex, Truth, Pleasure, and an Unfinished Revolution. Her reporting and essays have been published in the New York Times, The Cut, Elle, Vice, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, among many others. She's the co-author of Girl Drive, Crisscrossing America, Redefining Feminism. She is also the editor of an award-winning anthology of her mother, Ellen Willis's rock criticism called Out of the Vinyl Deeps, as well as a comprehensive collection of Willis's work, The Essential Ellen Willis, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. Dr. Lorna Bracewell is a political theorist and associate professor of humanities at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. Her scholarship focuses on feminist theory and the history of political thought, and has been published in academic journals like Science, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and popular forums like the Washington Post. Her first book, Why We Lost the Sex Wars, Sexual Freedom in the Me Too Era, offers a revisionist history of the feminist sexuality debates of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, foregrounding the influence of liberal concepts such as freedom of expression, the public-private divide, and the harm principle. Christine Emba writes about ideas for the Washington Post's opinion section. She is the author of Rethinking Sex, A Provocation. Before coming to the Post in 2015, Christine was the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism at the New Criterion and a deputy editor at The Economist Intelligence Unit, focusing on technology and innovation. Our moderator, Irin Carmon, is a senior correspondent at New York Magazine, where she covers gender, law, politics, and more. Her investigative reporting on sexual harassment and assault has been recognized with numerous awards. She is the co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Previously, she was a CNN contributor, a contributing writer to the Washington Post, a national reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, and a staff writer at Salon and Jezebel. We are honored to welcome this distinguished panel.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I want to thank my distinguished panelists for joining us tonight at this conversation on rethinking feminist sexual politics. It's a real treat that we're going to get some time to talk about three really interesting, provocative, yet nuanced books that resituate how we think about sex, consent, feminism, that contain really thoughtful readings of history, and bring both analytical and at times in 2 out of the 3 books, memoir lenses to this really important topic. So before I bring you all together in conversation, I want our viewers, readers, listeners to understand sort of the foundation of what you were doing in these 3 books. And so I want to start with you, Lorna. Tell us about your book. And I'm really interested in the title and who the we is in the title.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm so honored to be included in this conversation. So my book is called Why We Lost the Sex Wars. And what prompted me to ask the question was a kind of sense that began to develop when I first started. I'm a political theorist, I should say. So this book was my dissertation to get my PhD in political theory. So when I was starting out thinking about what I might write my dissertation on, I was kind of dogged by this sensation that queer theorist Eve Sedgwick calls Christmas effects. I'm going to butcher her, wonderful prose, but she says something about like the most tedious thing about Christmas is that all the institutions are kind of aligned and speaking with one voice. And it's this kind of monotonous, monochromatic discourse, Christmas this, Christmas that. And I was having that feeling about kind of contemporary feminist sexual politics. I felt like the discursive parameters were really stifling and narrow and inadequate to the kind of problems of sexual justice that feminism is supposed to be confronting. And so I was just kind of desperate to find anybody saying anything different about sex than like, it's good and it's fun. And as long as, it's like, done in kind of private between two consenting adults, like, what else is there to say about it? And so I decided to turn to the history of the feminist sex wars just to look for that remedy to that Christmas effect sensation that I was having. And lo and behold, I found, a tremendous amount of variety of kind of feminist analyses of sexual politics in that historical moment. And I also found that kind of received understandings of the sex wars were really misleading and inaccurate in all kinds of ways. And so my book is kind of a work of historical revisionism. I'm trying to recast the history of the feminist sex wars in what I hope are more politically and theoretically productive and generative ways. And I guess, I'm kind of trying to retrieve some of what I think is the wisdom that has been forgotten from that period. I think that part of what we've forgotten is that all these feminist positions that were staked out during the sex wars, and feminists did not agree on everything during this period. It's called the sex wars for a reason. It's this kind of sororicidal conflict that ends friendships and damages relationships, and people are still not over it. But one of the things that kind of feminists shared during this time period was this like suspicion of a kind of simplistic liberal sexual politics. Whether you're talking about anti-pornography feminists like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, or whether you're talking about feminists who I call sex radical feminists, like take Patrick Califia or Gail Rubin, what kind of united them was their shared sense that the sexual politics of post-war liberalism, which was a kind of anti-censorship, sexual freedom as expressive freedom, personal liberty, privacy kind of oriented sexual politics, that was really inadequate and pernicious, actually. And so you have feminists kind of critiquing this liberal sexual politics from all directions in the earliest phases of the sex wars. And so I'm really interested in retrieving some of those feminist critiques because I think they're apposite or appropriate now. And then to answer the part of your question where you said, who's the we, or what's the title? I mean, the we is all of us. I mean, like in a very capacious sense, like feminists, people who, believe that sexual equality and sexual justice are important things, people who believe that there's too much sexual violence in the world and that there should be less, people who believe that there is a kind of insufficient amount of, what my friend political theorist Joe Fischel calls, democratic hedonism, like sexual pleasure is not equally distributed. There, so people who are committed to a kind of egalitarian sexual ethos, that's the we. And I think that the sex wars was a real fecund moment for thinking about how we might go about achieving some of those great feminist desideratums. But unfortunately, we've forgotten so much of that history. And so that's why, we kind of lost. But I don't think it's over, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll go ahead and pass the mic to the next speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, one thing that I was really struck by in your rewritten history, and we're going to talk a lot more about this because it comes up in all three books, is this notion of sexual liberalism as being really distinct from both of those poles of feminism. The one that you call sex radical and the one that you call anti-pornographic. And I think in some ways, because you write about kind of an appropriation of liberalism of both sides, it's become easy to say, well, this is feminism's failure when people are critiquing or dissatisfied with the current sexual order. And actually, I found in all three of your books that there was this feeling of this is, it's either this was not what feminism intended, or this is not the liberation that was promised. But implicitly, it's also falling short of the feminists as they describe it. It sounds like basically you think that there's been this simplistic narrative, and what we have now is neither side, even though there weren't just two sides, ideals. And that's something that I picked up from your book as well, from Rethinking Sex, Christine. A Provocation is the subtitle. I'll have more questions about the book specifically, but I want to hand you the mic to ask you, how did you come to write this book, and tell us about your argument?
Sure, thank you. So yes, Rethinking Sex, A Provocation came out this March, and thank you so much for having me in this group to talk about it. It really does feel like we have so many commonalities in what we're thinking about in terms of both the past and future of feminism today. So Rethinking Sex is in some ways a call to arms against our current sort of anything goes sexual culture. And I wrote it to critique the idea that consent, or rather the assumption that consent, just getting sort of the right kind of consent, whether we've gone from no means no to yes means yes to enthusiastic, is the only standard that we can have for whether sex is good or not. That past the question of consent, we should ask no further questions and no longer interrogate our interactions. I also pushed in the book to question whether some of the assumptions that we have raised and sort of held on to post the sexual revolution and post the sort of high watermarks of the feminist movement are correct, whether they are actually helping us, especially sort of young women and men who are making their way through the world today, or whether they're harming us in some ways. So I'm an opinion columnist for the Washington Post, where I write on ideas in society, which is sort of the vaguest beat possible, which is wonderful, except for the 24 hours before I need to come up with a column idea and I'm like, the whole world is out there. But I've always been interested in questions of culture, society, and ethics, and how we should treat each other. In some ways, what we owe to each other as individuals to a community and vice versa. And of course, I'm a young woman living in the world, and gender is incredibly interesting and important to me. And I ended up writing a lot about the Me Too moment as it was happening in 2017 and 2018, a number of columns. I found that moment galvanizing in my thinking about the question of feminism, where it is and where we go next. Because that moment showed that many of the problems that we had hoped we had moved past, we haven't moved past. You know, the problems of sort of sexual assault and women being preyed upon by those with greater power had certainly not ended. And of course, some of those cases had very clear right and wrongs. Harvey Weinstein should not, in fact, be assaulting his underlings in, a hotel room. You should, in fact, get consent before you have sex with someone. Otherwise, that is assault. Sexual harassment is not acceptable. But I was even more fascinated by some of the sort of more gray area cases, in some cases, the less high profile stories that nonetheless often went seemingly the most viral. So I'm sure many of you remember the New Yorker short story, Cat Person, which is still the New Yorker's, I think, most read piece of short fiction ever. It's simply a short story about a young woman who goes on a date with a slightly older man. They have sex even though she doesn't really want to, and then it ends and he calls her some nasty names. There was also the sort of Aziz Ansari debacle when the comedian went on a date with a young woman who later confessed to a women's website that it was the worst night of her life because Ansari had tried to pressure her into sexual contact and she acquiesced to some but didn't feel good about it. And these are tricky issues that weren't very easily resolved. You couldn't really just say, well, he should have gotten consent or he should have asked properly and that would have fixed the situation. There were so many things hiding under the surface. And these are the questions, the ones that weren't so easily resolved, that seem to resonate with young women and men and were still causing a lot of pain. So in Rethinking Sex, I wanted to dig into some of these tricky gray areas a little bit more deeply and take stock of where we were, figuring out what ailed our sexual culture that so many young women would say, yes, this terrible to mediocre encounter is normal. I relate to that. That's just what sex and relationships are like today. So I wanted to ask, what assumptions are we holding that aren't serving us? Where did we think the sexual revolution should have taken us? And where did we end up? And what ethic do we actually need to improve our relationships with others, our sexual encounters, our understanding of feminism and equality, if simply getting consent is no longer enough, as it clearly was not? So I spoke to dozens of young women and men to hear what they thought of sort of the state of sex and our sexual culture and even feminism today, whether they were enjoying it, whether they felt that something was missing, whether they felt that something had been misunderstood, and also, of course, what they would have in its place. I heard a lot of heteropessimism and a lot about consumerism and a longing for relationship and a settling for less. Many young women talked about how they identified as feminists, or at least they thought that they did, or they used to, but they in some ways felt that modern feminism had served them a bill of goods in some places, or was no longer as relevant as it used to be. And I think this has to do with it being co-opted by liberalism, as you and Lorna just discussed, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But the book ended up delving into sort of bigger questions, not just about sex or feminism, but also sort of the meaning of the things that we take for granted, the assumptions that we have embedded into our concept of feminism and freedom in the 21st century. So whether it's the idea of freedom, what privacy really means, and how much of it is actually good, assumptions that we've made about desire and sex difference and what equality should look like and what even love looks like. And I've been fascinated by the response from readers who felt that they found themselves reflected in at least the questioning of the status quo, even if they weren't sure where to move to next.
Well, thank you for setting that up so beautifully, Christine. I mean, we'll get into it more, but I definitely think your subtitle of provocation is well put. And I'm so, it was really interesting to read Why We Lost the Sex Wars and your book back to back, having read Nona's Galley a few weeks earlier, because there is so much of what you say that I think that the anti-pornography feminists of the 1980s would have strongly identified with. Including critiques of pornography, critiques of sadomasochism and other more marginalized or less common at the time practices. You do write that you're focusing on heterosexual partnerships, which they didn't only focus on. So there'll be much more to say, but I think that sets us up beautifully to go into Nona's forthcoming book, Bad Sex, which is a phrase that comes up again and again in all three books. Nona, tell us about Bad Sex.
Sure. Bad sex is not just about bad sex per se. It's also about sort of what makes our relationships, from the most casual encounters to the deepest, longest committed relationships, go bad. So it's sort of a play on words. I do address what Christine's book addresses, which is this fundamental question of like, what is good sex beyond consent? And like Lorna's book, I turn to the feminists of the past, particularly the second wave feminists, though not exclusively the second wave feminists, to help answer these questions. But rewinding, I was born to one of these feminists who were asking these questions in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Her name is Nona Willis, and I sort of grew up with this idea, with sort of a very pro-sex lens on feminism, not to be confused with the sort of liberalism of anything goes besides consent. I don't think my mom would have ever said that, and neither would any of her friends. But I did also grow up in the 90s, where I think that was like the peak of that philosophy was afoot. And sometimes it was labeled feminism, sometimes it wasn't. But it was very much like feminism equals getting as many orgasms as you can and having a lot of sex and loving it, and that's it. And I decided to write this book shortly after my divorce, which divorce is kind of a loose term because I got married for health insurance. I didn't really believe in marriage, but I had this long committed relationship at the heels of dissatisfaction from hookup culture, basically. I mean, that's like a very distilled way to put it, but I sort of in this book have this liberation from this unsatisfying relationship, and which was itself a reaction to how bad hookup culture was, and then find myself like 8 years later in a really confusing and kind of multi-layered sexual landscape where I truly want to figure out my authentic desires, but don't always know how to do it. And I think unlike Christine's book, I think I kind of, I say on one hand, the hookup culture, casual sex is unsatisfying, but also if you do achieve what a lot of women purport to say they want, especially heterosexual women, which is a committed relationship, there are also sort of like toxic dynamics and expectations waiting for you on the other side. And I think some of those expectations come from patriarchal society. Some of them come from different iterations of feminism. And as somebody who's always been attuned to feminist history, I decided to kind of, and this is like actually real, this wasn't even like an exercise for the book. It's like when I was going through kind of this crisis of what are my authentic desires, both with love and sex, I truly did start to read a lot of history. I read my mom's work through a different lens, through the lens of someone who'd gone through a divorce and now truly really wanted to figure out what I actually wanted and whether any of that was possible. But I also discovered all kinds of feminists I didn't even know existed. I learned all about the political celibates. I learned all about the feminists that Lorna writes in Why We Lost the Sex Wars. I mean, I went back to the 1800s, to the sex radicals of the mid 1850s. I went back to Emma Goldman and some of the contradictions that she went through in terms of free love. And unfortunately, I didn't come up with clean-cut answers as to whether or not my authentic desires are ever going to be uncovered, or whether we can ever have authentic desire that's divorced from the culture that we grew up in, which, I mean, I think the clear answer is it's really, really, really difficult, if not impossible, to do that. But if that's the case, like, does it matter that some of our desires align with oppressive systems or what oppressive systems want us to do? Should we try to reprogram our desire? How do we make our desire active rather than just sort of a default? And it's, I mean, you'll have to read my book to see, but what I conclude is that it's sort of like a dangling carrot of a journey, kind of always sort of out of your reach, because sex itself and also love, I mean, two of the craziest, hardest things to pin down, are always going to be changing and always going to be really, really difficult to parse out between, what's truly your desire and what people expect of you. But the book is sort of the arc of me being in this really unsatisfying relationship and not ending it for reasons ranging from super traditional to super feminist, and then ending up on the other side with a better sense of my desires, but still, never quite pinning them down. So that's the best way I can describe my book.
Thank you. I want to just briefly give you all an opportunity to drill down on a phrase that we've all been using really loosely, which is liberalism. and what that might mean in this context. It's something Ellen Willis critiques, and one thing that I really loved about Bad Sex was learning not just about your personal relationship with your mother, which I was really just interested in because I admire her and I admire you, and just knowing what it was like, but also your rereading of her work, which very much falls into this tradition of, I think that better than almost anyone threaded the needle between these notions of sexual liberation without being co-opted by a kind of commercial vision. And it's a very hard balance to pull off. I think what I'm hearing from all three of you is that synthesis, that kind of isn't just like sexuality defined by Hugh Hefner and his descendants, but also trying to seek some kind of feminist vision is a really challenging one to articulate because of the kinds of ambiguities that you talk about, Nona. So tell me a little bit, Lorna, let me start with you, because I think you all three of you have the historical context of this. The words privacy and autonomy and liberalism are run through all three of your books. But I'm just going to start with you, and then I want Christine and Nona to just jump in. Like, what do we mean when we say that there's a feminist sexual ethic that evolves or should evolve, or that you try to find that is separate from quote unquote liberalism, which is a term I feel like we should define?
Yeah, and it's like a notoriously promiscuous term, right? I mean, to call somebody a liberal, it can mean they're a progressive or the opposite, right? I mean, It literally tells you nothing about somebody's politics because it's just been stretched beyond all kind of meaning. In my discipline in political theory, we have a very kind of precise, particular, narrow way of using the term liberalism. The way I explain it to my undergrads when I, harp on about this every semester is I'm like, when I say liberalism, you probably, if you're like an American in the 21st century, you think like the 1960s. You think like Woodstock and the sexual revolution and all that stuff. But actually, if you want to understand what liberalism is for political theorists or political philosophers, you need to like think more about like the 1660s. So liberalism as we use it as a term of art, it has to do with the kind of assertion that individual liberty is the purpose of government. We institute governments for the sake of protecting a kind of a priori natural liberty, right? And the language of rights comes into play here, right? But the kind of purpose and function of government, the only legitimate function of government, if you're thinking from a liberal perspective, is to preserve this kind of private domain of individual liberty. And often liberty is conceptualized in purely negative terms. So it's a liberty to be left alone. It's a freedom from, right? So liberalism is the kind of conceptual ideological apparatus that gets articulated to accomplish and affect that purpose of, enacting a state whose purpose is to kind of protect individual rights and individual liberty. Freedom of choice, right, is language that's strongly associated with liberalism. In the context of kind of sexual politics, right, you mentioned Hugh Hefner, right? I think he's a great example of, a figure who embodies this kind of post-war liberal, way of thinking about sex and the politics of sex, right? The problem that Hugh Hefner begins publishing Playboy to overcome is that we've had all this repression, right? Government has been interfering in the private sphere of individual sexual freedom in ultimately unjust ways that, on Hefner's analysis, cause all sorts of perversion and pathology, right? So he wants to free from restraint, right? The kind of liberty of the individual to peruse whatever erotic material they would like to in private. And it's not going to hurt anybody. Sex is harmless. Sex is apolitical when you're thinking about sex in this kind of liberal way. And the major obstacle to sexual freedom is kind of government interference or state interference or censorship.
Censorship, right? Obscenity laws.
Yes.
And one of the things that you point out is that sort of mid-century liberal view of sex is, I'm accustomed to thinking of it as not beneficial to feminist goals, but also that it's very normative, right? That it's very heteronormative, that it's sort of anti-kink, it's very white.
It's even anti-porn. And, you know, this really surprised me when I started to drill down into this. You know, I was reading a memoir by one of these lawyers who fought and won all these, you know, legal battles against obscenity laws in the 1950s and 1960s, a guy by the name of Charles Rimbaud. He was the lawyer who kind of argued that Lady Chatterley's Lover should be able to be published and not deemed obscene. So anyway, he writes in his memoir, The End of Obscenity, that one of the reasons that he devoted his life to fighting these anti-censorship battles was because he felt that censorship led to a kind of pornified culture. And if we could liberate sexual speech from these restraints imposed on it by censorious blue noses, we would actually have less perversion, more kind of normal, healthy, heterosexual vanilla sex.
You don't hear that argument so much anymore. Nona, I wonder if this is a good point for you to talk about the sort of the journey that you take in the book into the second wave's critique of that liberalism, including your mother's, but also the consciousness raising. I love that history deep dive. Tell me more.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people think about feminist sexual politics as being a 70s and 80s thing, sort of the parameters of Lorna's book, for instance. But actually, in the earliest consciousness raising sessions in 1967 in tiny East Village apartments, women were getting together and talking about what their worries and their fears having to do with their gender. And one of the major perennial issues was sex, was this sort of, they were in 1967, put yourself in 1967. This was when the sexual revolution had happened, but feminism hadn't happened. And so all of the liberalism that was started by Hugh Hefner and all these anti-censorship and also, you know, the counterculture and just sort of freeing the idea of like for what we would call today like slut shaming. It was like a very liberatory time for a lot of women because they, first of all, had the pill. Second of all, they were less likely to be stigmatized for having sex. But these women in these East Village apartments were acknowledging that this was all still on men's terms and that the sex that they were having was usually bad, that they felt like they'd lost the right to say no, that Aziz Ansari-like scenarios were happening all the time. And it was really a major concern of theirs. And then I think as the years went on, the anti-porn feminists sort of reset the terms of saying we want protection from assault and rape and like misogynistic porn rather than sort of a space to indulge our own desires. And I think that those early discussions were lost in the late 70s and early 80s discussions of sexual liberation. Or I think the pro-sex feminists like my mom tried to sort of bring them back, but this like purity of understanding what we're still trying to grapple with, which is how can you be sexually free in a misogynistic culture, because it's still gonna always be on an oppressor's terms. And I think that that's something like when I read the transcripts of some of these like rap sessions, I was just like, that literally could happen today. They were talking about wanting to have sex because they wanted to and not for any other reason, not for expectation, not because you felt bad for the guy or because you felt like you couldn't say no, but simply because you wanted to. That was in literally 1968. And I think that could still be what somebody says to another person in their living rooms.
I think it's something that many of the people that Christine interviewed told her, Christine, this I think is a good moment for us to get into. When I said your book is a provocation, and I'm wondering, is this a point of divergence in each of your books? Because you include a critique of this kind of privacy and autonomy sphere, but specifically, you also reject the argument that there just isn't enough liberation in the kind of sex that people are having now, that in itself isn't enough. You make an argument that men and women are fundamentally different in their desires and that we need to become more comfortable, or feminists need to become more comfortable with embracing fundamental differences between men and women. And you also, this is also very provocative. I did find myself bristling when I first read it in the excerpt, although I thought reading it in the context of the fuller book helped me understand better. But you also say that there are some forms of sex that are inherently less ethical or less moral, which also, again, reminds me of some of the anti-pornography feminists. You also have a critique of pornography, which I want to talk about in a bit. But tell me about how you read this history. You read the same critiques of the kind of liberal sexual liberation, quote unquote, ethic, but you came to a slightly different conclusion than I think an Ellen Willis might, in terms of how to move forward. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, that is a great summation of many of the parts of the book that I think people have found provocative. But actually, I'll note, and then get back to this later, that I'm not sure that Ellen Willis would have disagreed with me on all of this, in fact. And there are some lines from her that I quote in the book, actually, that are, sort of relevant to this discussion and how I framed it, because reading a lot of her work was actually really influential for me. So, in the book, I have a chapter fairly early on, actually, titled "We're Liberated, but We're Miserable," which is a strong title, but that actually came from just interviewing and speaking to millennials and Gen Zers who were, dating today, and talked about sort of the disappointment and confusion that they felt. Ostensibly, we are in sort of the most sexually free, well, we were, I would say that post-Dobbs, maybe this has changed a bit, but, one of the most sexually free eras in history. Contraception is available. There is less stigma, very little stigma at this point around premarital sex. The age of marriage has moved much later for women and for men. So everybody should be having a great time. And yet, so many people are in fact not, to the point that we're in what has been termed by a number of writers as a sex recession, where young people especially are simply choosing not to have sex, or are either being pushed into this place. And speaking to people, one of the things that I heard sort of again and again was that the sort of liberatory, anything goes atmosphere sort of left them feeling lost in some ways. Now that kind of the rules were gone, there's very little sort of understanding or direction for what they should actually be doing, how to form relationships with each other. And then also in the space of sort of total liberation, in some ways, it is the most confident and, in fact, sometimes the most malign who are best able to take advantage of spaces where there are no rules. So, men were exerting their privilege over women and suggesting that, like, well, this is freeing. Why don't you want this? This is liberation. Why aren't you enjoying this? And I found this really fascinating, in fact, that this feeling actually that limits were in some ways missed by people. And also because, in a liberatory atmosphere, it was almost seen as kind of the key to being sort of a modern person, a young person who's really enjoying the world, a way to sort of experience life, to be having, as others mentioned, kind of as much sex as possible, or sort of as many different experiences as possible. In some ways, it felt not liberatory, but somewhat pressurizing. If in the past there was pressure to not have sex, not talk about sex, to repress your desires, in some ways, this moment felt like there was pressure to do more, to always be enjoying, to always be out there, experimenting and doing what was asked and trying things that you might not even be interested in because, well, this is freedom. You should take advantage of it. And I talk about this in terms, well, I interrogate in the book the term sex positivity, which has become in some ways synonymous or used sometimes interchangeable with sort of this idea of sexual liberation in the common term. And, you know, I think that one of the things that young people are noticing today is that the term has ballooned in scope. And rather than being actually sort of positive and freeing, it has become in some ways a little bit oppressive. So originally sex positivity meant something specific, and it was actually coined by Nona's mother in an essay called Lust Horizons. And this was sort of a pro-sex argument, but it was a specific one. It was saying that, yes, women's sexuality should be recognized, shouldn't be quashed as a way of punishing men or punishing the patriarchy. It was kind of as a pushback to the idea of sort of political celibacy. But that was a specific critique, you know, aimed at a particular idea circulating in the feminist movement at the time in the late 70s, early 80s. But, you know, today the term within contemporary feminism has become a sort of general willingness, a shorthand for a general willingness when it comes to sex, sort of for being up for anything, often with anyone, with an emphasis on adventurousness and with the understanding that this is what liberation looks like. But within that, there is sort of the forced assumption that sex doesn't matter, that one shouldn't have too many feelings about it, that women and men want sex in the same way, generally go after it in the same way. Equality looks like having as much sex and being as gung-ho about sex as men do, when in fact, many people, women and men, don't find that liberating at all. And when it comes to desire, sort of questioning desire, and this is, I think, the moment that you said that you bristled, one of the things that I found in talking to people and wrote about in the book was also the question of, well, when does sort of liberalism and the focus on the individual, when does this negative freedom actually become negative? You know, it is one thing to say that we have our desires and that we want to act on them, obviously, and that our desires should be respected. And of course they should. We've seen so many times over the course of history and over the course of the feminist movements and sexual revolution, how the stigmatization of desire has been used to marginalize people. But in this moment, I spoke to a lot of young women and men who felt that in an atmosphere where sort of total liberalism and total positivity was expected, there was no room to interrogate or criticize their desires, not criticize as in marginalize, but ask, where is this desire coming from? Do I need to indulge it? What does this say about society at large? Can I even say no to something? Am I allowed to dislike something without being a conservative or a bad feminist or a prude or a repressed person? So, you know, I talked to young women. One of, I think, the most poignant stories in the book, and one that many people seem to resonate with, was I was at a party speaking to a young woman who I told her I was writing this book on sex, and she wanted to ask me advice. And she was telling me the story about how she was dating this guy. He was great, except that he choked her sometimes during sex, and she didn't really like that. But she consented to it because, you know, this is what people are doing these days. She's a modern sex positive person. This is kind of, she feels like she shouldn't push back against his desires or stigmatize what he wants. And she didn't feel like she had any recourse to say no. So was that okay? Was this situation okay? And to me, obviously, the situation did not seem okay. Obviously, you should be able to sort of take a stance on your own preferences. but also be able to ask questions about why something like this would immediately be acceptable, or why you felt that you could not push back against this, or where in fact these desires have emerged and why they've become so common in sort of basic heterosexual, I guess, sexual relations today. I think that an unwillingness, sometimes liberalism, this idea that everyone is an individual, autonomous, we should not push people to explain themselves or change their desires or change their behaviors or question themselves, has left us in a place where we're unable to critique and have real discussions about what good actually looks like, what the perhaps norms should be, so that maybe the median person can generally have or feel that it's possible to have a pleasant and non-terrifying sexual encounter, or indeed what standards as a society we should set when it comes to sex or relationships or dating and how we relate to each other, and what responsibilities we have to each other, even as we are acknowledging others to be individuals who are separate from ourselves.
So I think that that's really well put. I want to press you on the assertion that you make in the book, though, that what women want is fundamentally different from men. But I also want to give Lorna and Nona a chance to respond to what you said. So I'm actually not going to let you answer that question immediately. We'll get back to it. But because you laid out so much in your critique of sexual liberalism, I want to make sure that Lorna and Nona have a chance to jump in on that with the time that we have left. And just whoever wants to jump in first, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lorna. I feel like I spoke before Christine.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's quite a story. And it's a great illustration of how impoverished a lens liberalism offers to think critically about sex, like you were saying, Christine, like, because, you know, like, kind of like, was it consensual is the kind of beginning of a conversation about what that all meant. And we should have the tools. I mean, I'm just like, so you all have written memoirs. I'm an academic. I've not done that, but, you know, I will share, this will come as a surprise to no one. I am a lesbian, right? And, you know, so these little glimpses into, you know, I guess like the quotidian experiences of, like, you know, navigating the contemporary sexual landscape are like, I feel a bit like everyone's mother probably feels hearing these stories. It's like, what, you know? But yeah, like if you're your median heterosexual woman in the 21st century and man in the 21st century doesn't have the like conceptual resources to negotiate that, I mean, we're in a bad way, right? I'm thinking like, so there was a Teen Vogue article like several years ago. It was about like how to have anal sex or something like that, and it was like all making the rounds on Fox News, and everybody was all, you know, freaked out at, you know, that there's this kind of like effort to provide at least a foundation for teens to go off and explore these sexual possibilities. That to me is like, that's exactly what we need more of, right? And, you know, it's not a question only of whether it's consensual or not consensual, but it's like a question of like, does it feel good? And people.
Lorna, does Christine's critique, sorry to break up your flow, but I just want to make sure to tie it back. Does her critique to you rhyme with the anti-pornography feminist that you write about? Are there differences? Is it consistent with? Because I do hear a lot of, and there are critiques that, you know, you might think lost, like they might have lost in terms of like the proliferation of pornography and sex positive quote unquote approaches, or whatever it's understood to be, being much more prevalent. Do you hear a consonance with her critique in our very different contemporary landscape with what those feminists were writing about in the 80s?
Yeah, well, partly, I mean, you know, the stuff about, you know, like objectification and stuff, obviously that was their big beef with pornography, is they felt like it was kind of intrinsically dehumanizing, like a kind of two-dimensional representation of sex. There's something like intrinsically dehumanizing about that. And you know, so and like Andrea Dworkin talks a lot, not about choking actually, but for Andrea Dworkin, the film Deep Throat like really made quite an impact, and she was very animated around how kind of oral sex, a kind of sadistic enactment of oral sex was becoming normalized through pornography, which I think kind of rhymes with, Christine, some of what you're talking about, choking becoming like, oh, well, that's just like a thing that people do without having a conversation prior about whether or not we might enjoy this, right? As a kind of practice. So yeah, I hear some resonances, but where I think that they would diverge maybe with Christine, you were talking about like, there's a kind of intrinsic difference in what women want out of sex and what men want out of sex. I don't know that the anti-pornography feminists who I write about would go with you there. I think that certain offshoots of anti-pornography feminism, right, kind of cultural feminism in the 1980s, certain variants of, kind of lesbian feminism that are highly like separatist in orientation, certainly go there. But anti-pornography feminism, as it was kind of originally conceived by people like Robin Morgan or people like Andra Dworkin, right? They would vehemently reject the kind of biological essentialism, I guess, underpinning that kind of a claim. But I think where they would take it is they would say, like, look, like, not everybody wants the kind of heterosexual script, right? And it's not just that like men want it, women don't, but it's like we need to be open to people wanting like a variety of things with regard to sexuality. And we should like cultivate a sexual culture that facilitates and enables people to pursue those sexual aims rather than kind of, bed of Procrustes fashion, foisting them down, in this kind of narrow script. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think that's a great moment for Nona to come in, because you're both ambivalent about many of the same things that we've been talking about, but I don't think, if I read Bad Sex correctly, that you would go down the road of either re-embracing gender difference or referring to certain kinks or habits as inherently harmful. I mean, you do talk about ways in which you feel like things cross the line, but you also still, I think at the end, even though there's a lot of ambivalence, you do embrace a lot of non-normative scripts. So tell us how you came to that conclusion, despite feeling like the sort of capitalist liberal approach to sex was unsatisfying.
Yeah. So I think both my mother and I would agree that that missing anything from the past having to do with heterosexual relationships is extremely, extremely dangerous. And I think these feminists from the second wave were old enough to remember what it was like when there was maybe a little bit more chivalry, or maybe more of a right to say no, or probably not an expectation that you would get choked in bed, but that came with all kinds of other bribes and other regulatory behavior or regulatory expectations that I'm happy do not exist anymore. And I also will say that, like I said in the beginning of this, I sort of gravitated to a more committed relationship, partly in reaction to these like soulless, kind of like not very vulnerable sexual experiences that I was having in my early 20s. And I think it was a bit of a cautionary tale. I think that I think you're right. And a lot of people are right that more women want commitment than men. But I don't think that that's an intrinsic difference. I think that it's a socialized difference, and it's not necessarily going to make them happy if they eventually do find that. I think what does make people happy, and this is kind of what I explore in my book, is and also what Christine does acknowledge, is that no matter what kind of sexual encounter or romantic encounter you're having, like, you do need to drum up a huge amount of vulnerability for it to be worth anything. And that's a huge ask, again, in like a misogynistic culture. Like, there's a lot of self-protection going on because a lot of men are, again, not that they don't want sort of vulnerable, transcendent encounters, but they're socialized not to engage with them. And so why, as a 22-year-old woman, like trying to have sex, would you be vulnerable in that way? It's really a huge risk. And sex is always going to be a huge risk, I believe, even in like a utopian culture where there was no misogyny, it's still, is a very kind of like risky encounter where you really do have to surrender to the other person and really trust them a lot. And so I think that kind of gets to the other issue, which is like, is some kind of sex ultimately damaging no matter what? I think it like really depends on the context. It can't just be kind of like in a vacuum of like, is choking always wrong? Like I don't think that that BDSM like approached correctly and in the right context is intrinsically unethical. And I know that, Lorna, you're saying like, you know, Andrea Dworkin and Robin Morgan would never say that there's like a fundamental difference between men and women, but I do remember them both saying something like, women want softer, more vulnerable sex. And like, you know, Robin Morgan was like, every woman knows in her gut that this like P in the V, I'm sure she didn't say P in the V, but like intercourse, like aggressive sex.
It's anachronistic.
Yeah, I know, is not for her. And then a lot of women, including lesbians, begged to differ. They were like, I do, like, you know, Dorothy Allison at the Barnard conference was like, I'm a lesbian. I love BDSM. I love getting fucked in the ass or whatever she said. And so I do think that was a fundamental misstep. I think my mother felt that way. And I also feel that way, that was a fundamental misstep of parsing out biological or intrinsic differences. And I just also do think that, again, like what I think my book really gets into is sort of what does committed relationships, what do they look like now? And what kind of expectations are they beholden to? It's not just like going off into the sunset and having a committed relationship. It's like, how do you escape these tropes, both like feminist expectations and misogynist expectations? So it's really, I mean, I know that's kind of like not very optimistic. And I actually do think that my book is more optimistic than I'm making it seem. But I think just because women desire committed relationships, they also have to interrogate those desires as much as like choking during sex, I think.
So,
and monogamy too. They have to interrogate monogamy and what that really means and why, and what their jealousy means and how that's interpreted culturally.
Can I jump in to respond to this point about, you know, kind of anti-pornography feminism? And I think what Andrea Dworkin and her ilk kind of meant is that patriarchy has constructed an asymmetry of vulnerability with regard to sex. That is not an essential, biological, inevitable, natural asymmetry. It is a socially produced and constructed asymmetry. So yes, men and women under conditions of patriarchy certainly experience sex different, right? But that is not because of some intrinsic, ineluctable, you know, gendered feature of men and women.
Yeah,
Christine?
I think that's a really good point. I think I would push back on that only slightly. In fact, first, I would say that I'm not actually trying to necessarily be a total biological or gender essentialist and say that, you know, women only want soft sex and men only want, you know, like really intense choking related sex. But I do think that one of the sort of flattenings that has happened in some ways in sort of the postmodern feminist moment is this suggestion that, you know, men and women should sort of go after sex in the same way, and that their vulnerabilities, as you were pointing out, are the same. And in fact, like this is a difference. And I think that this is something that earlier feminists were aware of. When it comes to sex, you know, women can get pregnant after sex, and the consequences for that tend to be different as compared to those who can't get pregnant after sex. And so there is a certain vulnerability there. And I think that actually ties into the critique that I make in the book that I still feel most strongly about, which is, you know, the idea that actually the original feminists really did have a revolutionary idea in mind, you know, smashing kind of a patriarchal system that centered male preferences and toxic value systems and assumed that kind of the male system and the male body was the default. and replacing it with a new vision that also allowed in women and their distinctive concerns and valued and protected those. And I think what many have observed in this moment is that sort of the most modern and most recognizable forms of feminism to younger people, the sort of girl boss and lean in feminisms, what you might actually call neoliberal feminism, to go back to that term that we were trying to describe, actually sort of ignored that ask and settles for less. So rather than dismantling sort of a male-dominated system and saying, look, women's specific female concerns should be valued too, you know, we got to a place where feminism, or the equality that feminism was aiming for, was just the equality to be like men, to act like men, to pursue sex like men, to pursue relationships in the manner of, in fact, usually the most toxic male stereotype, noting that many men actually want relationships, want commitment, want vulnerability, want at least to be able to discuss, you know, consent and other options, to not be sort of put into some square of what male sex looks like and what female sex looks like. So the problem, I think, is that just women were not respected as themselves, but asked to be something else.
Well, I feel like we have just scratched the surface of some of the profound differences in each of your arguments here, but also since we only have about 1 minute left, I'm just going to say that one thing that I got from all three of the books is a defense of the notion that might not be so apparent in liberalism, which is that sex has meaning, regardless of what values you place on it. It's not just, does it feel good, or did the person say yes or no? There's an infinite complexity. And I really want to thank the three of you for helping us begin to understand some of that complexity, even where you come at it differently. For much, much more, of course, please check out these books: Bad Sex, Rethinking Sex, and Why We Lost the Sex Wars. Thank you so much to all of our panelists.
I want to thank Nona Willis Aronowitz, Dr. Lorna Bracewell, Christine Emba, and Irin Carmon for being with us today. For the rest of you, please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming salons like this one. Finally, the New York Historical Society is currently open on Wednesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website. We hope to see you on Central Park West to view Title IX, Activism on and Off the Field, now open in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery through September 4th. Thank you again.